Worship leader, in this video, we are going to explore the question, are click and tracks the silent killer of church music? This is going to be a reaction video. If you haven't seen this video that's come out by channel Terence, we're going to be watching through the video live. I'm going to share my thoughts, both the pros and cons that I see, and I'm really thankful for Terence for putting this video out. I think it's a very thought-provoking for us as worship leaders. But before we do that, I want to take you to a place where you could download a free guide. If you head over to Influential Worship, especially if you're just starting in your worship leading journey, I've put together a free guide that's going to teach you 6 practices that if you implement this week will help you gain a greater sense of confidence in your worship leading. I wish I knew these things when I started my worship leading journey. I actually want to show you a little bit of what this looks like. So let me navigate you over here and just show you this. The guide is going to look like this. It's going to walk through the practices, and it's actually going to give you actionable steps like this here. You'll see at the end of practice number 1 here, there's an action step for each of the 6 practices. So again, I would love to get this into your hands. If you head over to influentialworship.com, you could get that completely free. But with that, let's dive in. What we're going to do here is I'm going to put my display on one more time. We're actually going to watch this video together. I'm going to pause it at certain points and just comment and share my real-time thoughts with you. Would love to hear your real-time thoughts on this video as well. So drop those in the comments throughout the video. And I do just want to say this right up front as we start the video. Once again, I hope my tone in this comes across as just thankful for Terence posting this. It's extremely thought-provoking. You know, there's things that I agree with, there's things that I disagree with, but again, I'm super thankful for him posting this video. I think we need to think about this and think about the why behind introducing click and tracks in our worship ministry. So without further ado, let's roll this and we will track along.
Ableton Live, Pro Tools, Easy Worship, Pro Presenter, and other music production tools have pretty much destroyed the landscape of church music as we know it. And as these tools get better and more easily accessible, church music is going to be changed forever. But this is the reality we live in now, and if you aren't using these tools, your church is probably outdated. So should we be using these tools, or is it just something that's going to continue making us lazy and kill our creativity? Let's talk about it.
All right, I'm going to pause it there for a second. You know, he does pose an amazing question here. He talks about, should we be using these tools? Which again, I think we should be asking ourselves, like we have to get to the why behind why we want to introduce them. And there is some valid points that he makes that, you know, man, the reality we live in the church music world, especially in the modern church music context, is click and tracks are becoming more and more prevalent. Again, there's pros and cons to them. We'll talk about that as we go throughout the video. But there is the reality that, man, they're here to stay. I don't think they're going anywhere, right? They are here to stay. And so again, we have to decide. The million-dollar question is we have to decide, okay, if we're going to introduce them in our ministry, what are the reasons for doing that? And I think that's probably the number one thing, is just drilling down on like, man, getting to the motivation of why are you wanting to do this? If the answer is just feeling like, man, there's pressure because everyone else is doing it, personally, I don't think that's a good enough reason as a worship leader to introduce click and tracks to your ministry. I think we have to drill down a little deeper than that. So we'll talk about that as we go throughout the video. Let's continue rolling on here.
So studio-produced music departments in churches are all the rage now. You've seen the videos where the entire band has in-ears in, the track is going, the vocals are slamming, and the music is full and all of this kind of stuff. And it sounds like a big stage movie production. And this sort of new studio-produced music department thing is pretty much the norm now. And if your music department doesn't have some resemblance of that, you're probably behind the curve. But one thing that has come as a result of this sort of change is just a thing of pure laziness. Like, singers really don't have to learn the lyrics or anything anymore because they're on the screens and on the projectors, and the vocals are already singing the lyrics and the backing track. So, I mean, you don't have to put...
All right, I got to pause it right there. Now, he does have a valid point. I think a bone to pick here, right, is when he's talking about the confidence monitor, right, being up on the back screen, which again, if you're living in the land of introducing click and tracks, you most likely have a confidence monitor as well. So I think there's a bone to pick here. We have to be careful. It's supposed to be a confidence monitor, not one that allows us to be lazy like he's talking about. So again, he has a valid point that we have to then ask ourselves the question in our ministries and with our vocalists and even ourselves as worship leaders. We have to ask, like, man, Have we become lazy? Are we over-reliant on these tools? I think is the idea of what he's posing here. Now, as he's about to get into, he's talking about vocals being in the tracks. Man, I would just say this, like if vocals are in the tracks, like I think we're missing something, right? I believe personally, this is my conviction with Click and Tracks, like they're supposed to be a supplement, not a replacement to the musicians, right? So they're supposed to be a supplement. And I think certainly with vocals, like things, in my opinion, start to get really awkward if vocal tracks are included in the backing track. So he's going to talk about that here. And this is where I would just go like, man, I agree with him. Like if vocal tracks are in the tracks, I think we're missing something. So let's continue rolling on here.
Put much effort into it. Musicians really don't have to take time to focus thoroughly on learning music anymore because it's in the stems, it's in the backing tracks. So it's cool if you kind of miss a line or two here and there because it's going to be covered up. So musicianship and motivation has seriously been affected by this. But also using these tools in a lot of ways have made the job of church musicians and singers a lot easier. Like if you're at a church where you only have like 1, 2, maybe 3 musicians there and some singers that are just okay and probably can't sing that well, doing some music production can enhance that greatly and have you sounding like a full band and a record up in that joint. And because most modern church music that's out is heavily produced with a bunch of music layers and vocal harmonies and parts and all of that kind of stuff, music production can actually help you sound like the record when you're performing it in church on Sunday. And it cuts down on rehearsal time because you can just send the stems and the tracks out to the musicians and singers, have them go over it and show up and do it on Sunday. And it's a big way to make a sort of old traditional church be more modern. That's
all right. I'm going to pause it right there. Now, this is something where I agree with what he's saying. Like, you know, he's kind of given some pros and cons here, but a pro that he is touching on is like, hey, there are some advantages to using Click and Tracks, especially when you talk about, okay, we're using a recording of a song, a live recording or a studio recording. We're using that recording as a reference, but with stems now and tracks, we actually have the ability to send out those rehearsal mixes. This is what multitracks.com calls them. This is what we actually utilize at our church. We utilize rehearsal mixes. Now, I have seen a massive advantage and pro of this being that we actually are able to give our musicians very effective tools for drilling down on like, hey, these are actually the parts, the layers that make up these songs. And so it becomes a great way to equip our teams. Now, if we are, again, using them as just replacements where we're like, hey, we're just keeping everything in the tracks and it doesn't really matter if you nail the parts, which is kind of what he's alluding to there. He's kind of saying like, hey, the musicians are kind of like, well, man, it's going to be in the track anyway. So if we flub a note here or there, like no big deal, it's going to be in the track and it's going to be covered up. Like if we're keeping all the parts in the track and we're just essentially doing like, you know, Christian karaoke, like I agree with Terence here, right? I'm going like, man, I think we're missing it. If we're leaving everything in and we're just simply singing along to the track or even playing our parts over, you know, what the track is doing and kind of letting the track cover and bury our mistakes. Like, again, I think we're missing it. And I think we're actually not implementing Click and Tracks the correct way. But again, I just wanted to touch on that. He is touching on a huge advantage here. We're actually able to equip and resource our musicians really well with these rehearsal mixes and stems. So let's keep on listening here.
Said, there are 2 big issues with this that you should really know about. So I was doing a concert at this church a while back, and with this concert, we pulled out all the bells and whistles. I mean, we created stems, we rehearsed thoroughly, and we were slamming because all of the vocals were on point. We created stems for those, and everything was just really, really good. And I had a friend that I had invited to that concert, and a day or so later after the concert, I caught up with them and asked them what they thought about the concert, what they thought about how we did and all that. And their answer shocked me. The answer that they gave was just like, it was okay. And I was like, what? Okay? Did you hear all that stuff we had on? Did you hear those tracks? Did you hear us slamming and those vocal parts and those harmonies being on point and all that? And this is the part that got me. They said, yeah, I heard all of that and it was cool, but it sounded a little too perfect. It was almost like it wasn't even y'all that were performing the songs. And I was just like, wow. But the more I sort of reflected on that, the more I realized they were onto something. That sense of authenticity and that sense of like raw energy and pouring your soul into music when you're playing it live was all being covered up by like all of this perfection that we did in the music production. And it really made me question whether this goal we have of these perfectly produced music departments in our churches have sort of stripped away the very essence of what makes the music special. I mean, our music production at that concert was flawless.
All right, we're going to pause it right there because I got to touch on this. You know, I think he's making a very fair and valid point. We have to kind of look at the world we're in, right? And we go, okay, there's one side of it where, you know, people in our congregations even are used to, our ears are attuned to like this perfectly produced, all the vocals are tuned, like everything's time aligned, right? In terms of the drum transients and things. And so people are used to music that is produced really well now. So I think it's becoming increasingly noticeable when music is lacking. I mean, that's often where we get like the idea of people looking into the church world and they're like, yeah, it's church music, right? And we kind of get some of that like subpar standard of art just in general when it comes to the church. And I think a reason for that is, again, because our ears are so attuned to like listening for, I mean, things that are just really well produced. And so there's that side of it. But I think, you know, he's going, there's that side of it on the pendulum, but he's flipping the pendulum to now where you go, we've swung the pendulum when we are implementing click and tracks and things are just like production value just goes up and up and up. We're swinging the pendulum all the way to the other side where essentially what he's saying here, my interpretation of it, he's saying, you know, we can lose that authenticity and we can lose, man, just that personal connection where we know we live in a world where things aren't perfect, right? And where musicians do make mistakes. And again, a lot of people don't know this, but like even the live recordings that we watch from, you know, big churches and things, man, that's not like one take and everything's done, right? Oftentimes there's an overdub process where people maybe did mess up parts and they have to go and re-record them. So, I mean, sometimes we think like, oh, they're just hitting their marks perfectly. And we can lose sight of the fact that there's actually imperfections in some of these live recordings that are then on the back end of things are studio produced. So, you know, what he's saying here is when we get to that world of like everything's perfectly produced, even in our live services, and we get to that point where we're trying to close the gap on like perfection and just, you know, every day, like the mistakes and flubs that happen, right? When we close that gap to a point where like none of that exists, we can lose the human connection a little bit. We can even lose the authenticity a little bit, and especially if tracks are again covering up everyone, like we're not even being led by like real musicians, real vocalists at that point, right? We're just simply like singing along to a track. So I think he's posing a fair question here, where we have to ask ourselves, like, man, when is it too much, right? Like when is it too much, even specifically for our context? I would say, I think we have to keep that in mind and just go like, man, is it going to serve our context to introduce click and tracks? And then to what point will we go? Is it going to take away from the authenticity of what's happening? Are people going to be distracted by click and tracks being introduced? So again, I think we have to ask ourselves those questions for our specific context. So let's keep listening.
Wasn't really connecting with any of the audience members on any sort of deeper level. And one thing that I've really come to understand is that it's really sort of those imperfections that make the music special. It's really sort of the slight mess ups and the imperfect timing in a lot of ways that, you know, audiences really crave. Not this super produced music movie production type stage productions that we're doing at our churches now. Because you got to remember, it's not really about how.
I'm just going to pause it for a moment here. I'm not going to jump back to full screen, but just want to make a point. It's very clear. He's not saying that, hey, we need to like intentionally have flubs and mistakes, right? And this is something that can happen in the church world, is where we're like, oh man, like it's all about heart, and we almost excuse skill, like we make excuses for lack of competency. And so this is obviously not what he's saying, but I just wanted to make that point. Like he's saying to the point like where we overextend and we just have everything like perfectly aligned, and the production value is so stinking high that again we can lose some of that personal connection and authenticity. So let's keep rolling here.
How perfect we sound anyway. It's about how deeply the audience is connecting with what we're doing. Now, the other problem is that a lot of churches, particularly the smaller churches, don't have the resources or budget to even incorporate these sort of music production tools in what they do anyway. So they're left to kind of rely on the more traditional methods of, you know, just having like one or two musicians and somebody with a tambourine in the back. And that has created a stark difference between the churches that don't have it and the ones that do, which in turn has created another divide between churches based on preference, and we wonder why church is falling off. Even the churches that do have the resources to incorporate these sort of music production tools in their services, there's a bit of a learning curve to these music softwares and all of that, which can be really intimidating to a lot of musicians and a lot of people. Especially drummers have to learn that process of playing with click tracks and keeping time. And, you know, the singers got...
Yeah, I want to pause it right here because this is very true what he's saying. Like, I remember when we introduced just Ableton Live, for example, and we would have as a joke up at our church, our context, we'd put up a thing on the wall that says like last day since Ableton failure. And honestly, a lot of that was sometimes there's a learning curve with the technology and even the infrastructure you need in place. But even a lot of that was probably like the mistakes that happened were probably user error things that like we didn't set up things in the most efficient way. So we kind of had that joke of like, man, when was the last time Ableton failed? And so there can be this learning curve, right? There can be a pressure that comes with that of going like when we are relying on these things, right? If they go down, like how noticeable are things? He talks about this in another video. I don't believe it's in this video, but he has about 3 videos kind of around the same topic. He talks about like when the power went out at a church service and it was just like very noticeable, right? That the backing tracks went down. And again, I think that's where we have to ask ourselves, if they're supposed to be a supplement, right? Rather than the replacement, then it shouldn't be that noticeable when things go down, right? Like the band should be able to carry the room and carry the song. And I think this is the mentality he's fighting against here is if it's a supplement, like that's one thing, but if the backing tracks becomes the crutch, if the click and tracks becomes the crutch, and if that goes down, like people don't know what to do, I think that's the danger we have to fight against. And I think that's what Terence is arguing for here. Like if it becomes the crutch where the backing tracks is what's making the sound and what's making the song, and even in the case of worship service, what's making the service, if you will, I think that's the dangerous ground that we want to avoid, right? And so let's just continue on here. I didn't want to make the point, though, that again, what he's saying is very true. There is a learning curve that comes with this, right? And I think a lot of, just say one more thing on this before we keep watching. I'll say a lot of smaller churches, what he's saying about the budget, like there is a budget to this, right? There's a lot of gear you need, there's infrastructure you need, there's simpler ways that you can implement these things, but generally speaking, right, you are going to have to spend some money, and the learning curve, even if budget is not an obstacle, is pretty steep, right? And you have to invest the time into being able to go like, okay, how do we do this well, right? So it's not done sloppily. I mean, drummers do have to know how to play with the click track, not just drummers, the whole band needs to be able to learn how to play with the click track, which again, that could be a pro, that could be something that raises your level of excellence. But again, just acknowledging there is a learning curve to this. So let's keep watching here.
To learn how to get behind the vocals in the track and all of that kind of stuff and sync with them. And pretty much for anyone who hasn't really had the experience of performing or playing with backing tracks and stems and stuff like that before, the demand of the precision that you have to have with playing with backing tracks and stems can feel really stifling. It really does require a mindset shift from that sort of natural ebb and flow to a more rigid approach with sticking with a drum machine. But all that said, there are ways to use these music production tools where you aren't just relying on them solely and they aren't making you lazy and killing your creativity and all of that. And they're really just used as enhancements. Let me show you how. But right before we get to that, if you're getting value out of this video, or if you've gotten value out of any of my videos here on this channel, do me a quick favor and subscribe to the channel. That helps out with everything we're doing around here, and I would really appreciate it. So one of the things that makes using these tools lean more to the negative side is the fact that we are using tracks and stems and stuff that are created by and for other people. A lot of times people just buy like these backing tracks and stuff off these internet sites. So you have a bunch of music that you didn't play, that you didn't really have to learn that much. You got a bunch of vocals in the track that are not your vocalists at your church, so they sound nothing like you. So it's really almost...
Again, just want to stop it there. I won't go to full screen here, but I just want to stop it and say again, please do not use vocals in the backing tracks. I think there's very rare cases where that's going to sound good. And again, we don't want to replace the singers on our teams, right? So let's keep rolling here.
Like you're just putting a CD in the CD player, pushing play and starting to sing behind it. And while that's the best and sometimes only option for some people, it's really better when you have your own musicians and singers in your stems and tracks, and you have vocals that were created by your vocalist tailored to what you do and the way you do it at your church. So that means you still have to learn and go over the music thoroughly to, even be able to play it like that. That means your singers are still going to know the parts and all of that. So it's going to keep you from being lazy. So the first thing you want to think about doing is actually creating your own tracks and stems to use for your church. And if you don't know how to do that, I have a video coming really soon that's going to show you exactly how to do that simply and easily. So make sure you stay tuned for that. Now, another thing is that these music production tools and such and software and all of that can be really fickle. There have been many times where I've heard like the backing tracks and stems just straight go out in the middle of somebody's performance.
Yep.
And a lot of musicians, because they haven't prepared thoroughly, aren't prepared for those sort of mishaps. So they don't recover the song, and it's just a...
Yeah, and I want to pause it here. I think a key here is just going again, not shifting to an over-reliance on those tracks. And I think we have to ask ourselves, even with like back to the confidence monitor for the singers, right? It's supposed to just be a confidence booster, or again, the tracks, a supplement, right? And so when things go down, like our teams and us, even us as worship leaders, and I'm guilty of it, like I've been way too over-reliant on a confidence monitor before. And I think we have to ask ourselves, like, okay, if in our preparation, if that's not there, can I still lead through the song? Can I still pastor the room? Right? Can I still, for the musicians on our teams, can they still play the parts, right? Can they still know what to do if things do go down to where the song is still going to be served and the congregation set before us is still going to be served? And I think that's the key, is just, again, not that over-reliance on the tracks. Let's finish up the video here.
Straight crash and burn from there. And what's worse is I've seen that happen on some churches' live streams. So that crash and burn is out there for everybody to see. So what you want to do is make sure you go over and rehearse and practice that music as if you're playing it live with no backing tracks and no stems, so that if that kind of stuff happens, you're good to go. Now, the question of should these music production tools even be used in church at all is a huge subject of controversy. And it's something that I've done in another video, and you want to go here and check out that video right now to learn more about it.
Cool. Yeah, I would highly recommend checking out Terence's channel. I am very thankful. Like I said, there's a series of 3 videos. That's one of them. There's actually another one he's done, I believe it was like 6 months ago. And I just highly recommend watching them. I think he's being very thought-provoking with us as worship leaders and church musicians, right? Just asking ourselves these questions. And so I think the application for us today, if you're on the fence and you're kind of going like, man, should we be running click and tracks? Again, just coming back to drilling that, like ask yourself why, right? Try to find out what the motivation is. There are pros and cons. There's advantages. I think my personal experience with it is it does raise the excellence level of your team. And I think the biggest reason for that is that it gives people a target to shoot for, right? Oftentimes with the worship world, we have musicians coming from different genres and backgrounds, and whether we like it or not, worship music in and of itself is a genre, if you will. There's tones and there's styles that go along with the worship music that we play, right? That we when we miss those things, when we miss the mark on those things, it just doesn't sound quite right. Which again, you could make the argument. Some of what Terence is saying here is that, like, man, by using click and tracks and kind of having that reference point, are we losing some of that creativity and originality? Maybe so, right? But when we are shooting for, when we're shooting for replicating some of these songs, I think we have to ask ourselves, like, are we equipping our teams well? And the click and tracks can be a great resource for equipping our team well. Now, again, the flip side of that is just then asking ourselves, like, how do we make sure on our teams that it doesn't become a crutch? And I think a big part of that is like communicating expectations to our team members, like, hey, we're not going to be overshadowing your part, in the tracks. We're going to leave that up to you, and the track is just a supplement. I just think we have to have these conversations, and again, try to figure out what is the line, to what level will we introduce click and tracks. And man, if you haven't introduced click and tracks, again, I think that's a whole topic for a whole nother video. Like and subscribe to the channel, because we will talk about that eventually. Like, if you're thinking about how do we best do this, we're going to have some content that will talk about what is the best way to implement click and tracks with your team, some different, even things on technology that could be simpler ways, more budget-friendly ways. So again, like and subscribe to the channel for more content going over that. But put down in the comments below before you go today, just if you do utilize click and tracks, like what are the pitfalls you found? To what extent do you utilize click and tracks? Would love to hear. And I believe there's also people that could benefit from your comment being down below, as well as we learn from one another as a community of worship leaders and ministers of the gospel that are on our worship team. So please comment down below. Once again, if you've made it to the end of the video, you are a new worship leader, or even if you're a seasoned worship leader, go to influentialworship.com. Would love to get that free guide into your hands. And with that, friends, I will see you in the next video. God bless you and your ministry.